Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel Dissatisfied Philosophy. I have not posted a YouTube video in some time, but now that I moved into my new apartment and I've started grad school, I'm ready to get back on the YouTube video grind. Another reason why I have not posted a YouTube video, besides moving and all of the logistics involved in that, is that I have been very active on both my new Substack page, which is Hunter Coates, same name, and also I have been publishing or submitting journal articles to two different journals, as well as finishing up, adding finishing touches on my upcoming book. So all of those articles and that upcoming book are both going to be privy to this video. Today I'm going to be giving an overview of Gnosticism. What is Gnosticism? How do we differentiate Gnosticism from other forms of Christianity? And what texts are Gnostic, I guess. So I'm going to kind of go into that a little bit. I'm going to discuss a little bit of the scholarship. I don't want this to just be a video where I'm just naming scholars and naming books, right? That's what my papers and my book is for, right? But I can give a couple of names just to kind of situate you in the literature a little bit. So, what is Gnosticism? Well, Gnosticism was a term that was first coined in the 18th century. So we don't see that term cropping up at all in early Christianity. Now, this has led some people, those namely being this guy named Michael Williams, and then this female scholar named Karen King. Michael Williams wrote in 1996, King wrote in 2003, to say that we should no longer use the term Gnostic because it doesn't have a coherent referent. Just to say that when we use Gnostic, we're not really referring to anything. We're just kind of using it as this polemic term. Now, for quite a bit, a lot of people were like, yes, very true, King and Williams and King. But more recently, scholars have been like, while we agree with Williams and King that earlier uses of Gnostic, such as by figures like Hans Jonas in his 1950s book, The Alien God, and other people using the term Gnostic, like Samuel Vogelin, who was an American political scientist who wrote on Gnosticism. Political scientists writing on ancient history, not a great mix. And you can imagine the results, but a lot of scholars are saying, like, hey, like, maybe we can define Gnosticism. And I situate myself in that field. I think we can define Gnosticism. I think it's a great term. Now, although, like I said, the term was first coined in the 18th century, the term Gnostic, or Gnostikoi in Greek, was used in early Christianity. Now, how was this term used? Well, according to several sources, we have people like Irenaeus, we have Origen, we have this author of the text Refutation of All Heresies, which for simplicity purposes I'm going to call Hippolytus. I don't think it was written by Hippolytus, but let's say Hippolytus. And we also have Clement, and Epiphanius, and all of these figures relying on different sources, sometimes perhaps cribbing off of one another, but offering different takes, continually claim that certain groups are self-identifying themselves as Gnostikos. Okay, so we've established that Gnostics, was a term used by a group to self-identify. At one point, we see this specifically in the writings of one group known as the Nazarenes. Now, the Nazarenes are discussed by Hippolytus in his Refutation of All Heresies. And Hippolytus quotes some sort of Nazarene text. We obviously don't have this today. But he quotes this text, and in it, the author identifies as Gnostic. So we have clear knowledge, clear evidence that groups called themselves Gnostikos. But what does that mean? Right? So now we know that this term was being used. And I'm very unconvinced by the idea that that Christian opponents to this, like Irenaeus and Hippolytus and Epiphanius and so on, just made up that these groups were calling themselves Gnostics. And that doesn't make sense. All these different authors are saying this, and it just seems kind of speculative and sort of weird to say that no, actually, this was all just made up. So, and this also becomes more difficult to say when you consider that what we would call, as I'm going to explain, Gnostic Christians that are not Gnostic, also really liked claiming gnosis, knowledge. Now who, right? Gnosis is bad, right? That's what Gnostics like. They like secret knowledge. Well, no, actually. The author of 2 Timothy certainly liked secret knowledge in the sense of claiming combating false gnosis, which then Irenaeus used as the title of his book against heretics, against heresy. So does Paul way earlier in 1 Corinthians, where Paul's talking about how securing gnosis, but gnosis is built on love, right? Gnosis is built, true knowledge of Christ is built on the love of Christ. Then you have Clement, who wants to really emphasize that gnosis is a good thing. It should not be thrown away. You also have this 4th century desert monk named Evagrius Ponticus. Evagrius likewise says that gnosis is good, and he's summing up the views of people like Basil the Great, writing a little bit earlier. I believe Evagrius is 5th century, Basil is 4th century. And then you have people like John of Damascus writing in the 6th, 7th century even. And all of these figures are like, yeah, gnosis is good, but, we have to have true gnosis. So this again points to gnosis itself not being bad, and therefore the claim that these groups called themselves Gnostics seems to be historically accurate. Okay, we've established that early Christian groups called themselves Gnostics. What does that mean? Why does that matter? Well, this is where we get the rubber hits the road. As I mentioned, the whole Williams King position that we should not define Gnosticism. There's another position where we should. And to give you a definition is difficult. What I will say, and I think that this is such a basic recognition, and that any definition we give of something, not everything that fits that definition is going to perfectly fit that definition, right? In other words, take a chair. Go ahead and give me a definition of a chair. Well, you can't. But you can give me an ideal definition or a Platonic definition, and then we look at things and we go, yeah, that seems to be a chair. That's how we should treat Gnosticism. Just like we treat every other category. It's not something super special. It's a term we use to group beliefs that, not every single text that is Gnostic is going to perfectly correspond to that definition, but it is a very helpful guide, and it helps us categorize the landscape of early Christianity in ways that I think other definitions cannot do. With that said, my definition then of Gnosticism, and this is what I argue in the 2 articles and different parameters, different views of that definition, as well as my forthcoming book, chapter 1 of that, and then chapter 3 sort of as well. Gnosticism focuses heavily on the notion of a evil and ignorant and deceptive demiurge who created this universe. In other words, a heavenly being that was bad, that was wicked, and that was deceptive, created this universe, and that heavenly being is distinguished from an all-powerful and all-good God, which stands beyond this universe. So that heavenly being, the demiurge, has day-to-day control of the universe, oversees it. But where I come in, and this is where nobody else has done the due diligence, I survey the literature, and I find that there's very little work on this topic. It's the deceptive characteristic of the demiurge that constitutes Gnosticism, rather than believing in a demiurge in other instances. For instance, Platonists believe in a demiurge. Plato himself uses the term in Timaeus. Later Platonists would also believe in a demiurge. Now, there were some questions. This didn't really become a thing until the 2nd century BCE, and then it sort of picked up with Plutarch. And then it was picked up later with the Neoplatonist. But believing that a different being than the all-powerful God created the universe is not Gnosticism. Let's get that out of the way. That is, in fact, what the Gospel of John teaches. Just look at the prologue. The Word created all things, and the Word was God, and the Word was toward God, or the Word was God. The Word was with God, and the Word was God, or the Word was toward God. Very interesting Greek in there that is sort of confusing, but it seems that the all-powerful God and this sort of creative agent are distinguished, and this is not anything new. This is basic Jewish understanding of creation at the time. You have Philo of Alexandria writing, let's say, 30 years before Jesus, who is, like, all right, we have our Yahweh, but there was this creative principle that created the world. So, recognizing the belief in a demiurge is not Gnosticism. Recognizing the belief in a deceptive, ignorant, and wicked demiurge is Gnosticism. For those familiar with the literature on Gnosticism, I am being extremely particular in my words. I am using ignorant because, according to a Platonic understanding of the demiurge, the demiurge is not ignorant of the world that it is creating. That's a really good point that the scholar Dylan Burns makes in his survey of the demiurgical tradition in his 2014-2015 book, one of the two. I'm using wicked because it is not a good agent, like in Philo, like in the Gospel of John. It is a wicked agent that is creating the universe. And I am using deceptive because, unlike in any of these texts, more or less, Philo, John, whatever, the demiurge is not deceiving fellow heavenly beings and or humans. So that's where the difference comes in. It's the deception. It's a deceptive demiurge. Now I'm going to give you a couple of examples of what this means. I'm not going to go too much into this. I'm not going to give you my paper away, right? But I'll give you an example of I'll give you two examples, how about that, of what this means. So the first example comes from the text known as the Apocryphon of John. Now, the Apocryphon of John is, if you know anything about Gnostic text, it's probably the one you know the most. It's very famous, super highly read by Gnostics in antiquity, highly copied multiple times. There's two different versions, a short version, a long version, and we have two copies of each version. 3 are in the Nag Hammadi Corpus Library, and then 1 is in this codex that was discovered back in the late 1800s. And that's the short. The one that was discovered earlier was the short version, and the two shorts and the two longs agree with one another in terms of, like, individually. Like the two short ones, they're both short. They both basically have the same exact stuff. Two long ones, same whatever, same length, same content, more or less. And this text was written probably, I would say, late 2nd century, and maybe finishing touches were made in the early 3rd century. But I would definitely put it before Nicaea personally. Maybe some very late touches were put on after Nicaea, but I'm pretty happy putting it late 2nd century, very late 2nd century to early 3rd century. At least the finished product that we have today, putting aside any question of what texts were written before, which there's a recent article in the Gnostic, in the Journal of Gnosticism, or called Gnostic, by Einar Thomason, who discusses those proto-texts, if you're interested in that topic. But, so this text is largely seen as, like, kind of the first big Gnostic text, right? And so quoting a section makes sense. What I'm going to turn to, what I'm going to mention, is a use of deception that the demiurge does that is very much picked up in different ways by other later Gnostic texts. So that instance is when the demiurge says to his army of angels, I am the only God, and I am a jealous God. Why is this deceptive? Well, if you are familiar with the book of Isaiah, you recognize that this is from Isaiah. This is Isaiah 44 or 45, I believe. It's Yahweh speaking in Isaiah, but here it's the demiurge who is called Yaldabaoth in the text speaking and saying, hey, I am the only God, and I am a jealous God. Well, the author does something really interesting here. In both the short and long recensions, the author immediately clarifies after Yaldabaoth, the narrator immediately clarifies after Yaldabaoth speaks and says, Yaldabaoth cannot be the only God, because if he were the only God, who would he be jealous of? So what this is doing, in other words, is constituting a polemic against Yahweh, the God of Israel, that being the God of Jews and the God of many Christians at the time, right? This one is specifically directed, I would say, both Jews and Christians. So, in other words, what's being done here is the text is saying to you reading the text, assuming you are a good Gnostic, the Jews and Christians, they believe in a deceptive God who claims to be the only God. But in claiming this, the God has contradicted himself, because if he was jealous, who can he be jealous of if he is alone? To be jealous, you have to have someone to be jealous of. But this God claims to be alone. Therefore, this God is not alone. And there I have just exposed the contradiction in the biblical text, showing you that this God is in fact the demiurge, is in fact a lying, a deceptive, a wicked, and ignorant God. In other words, it is a statement saying to Jews and Christians that you have been following a false and deceptive God. You have been deceived cosmically from the beginning of creation onwards. You have been deceived and you are following a deceptive God. Therefore, all of your beliefs, all of your reading of the scriptures, all of this is invalid because all of it comes from Yaldabaoth. It's a very, extremely radical statement. Extremely radical sentiment, extremely radical statement that is being made in this text, right? Let's take another example from a different text. So I'm sort of drawing on my two favorite passages to illustrate this because it's just so explicit, right? But there's many other ones that are just as explicit, maybe a little less, but still very explicit in various texts that we would now call Gnostic, fitting that definition of Gnosticism that I explained, and corresponding to this data set of texts that we have, right? So another example is in the second treatise of the Great Seth, another text found in the Nag Hammadi documents, probably a 3rd century text, obviously probably with some stuff written before. We only have one tractate. We only know it through the Nag Hammadi. And this text has a really interesting part where it says, basically it goes through a list of the prophets and it calls them all laughingstocks. It uses a variant of the Coptic verb sobe, right? And it calls them all laughingstocks. It goes Adam, laughingstock, Moses, laughingstock, Abraham, laughingstock, David, laughingstock, on and on and on and on and on and on. And then you get, John the Baptist. Now that's interesting, right? John the Baptist is also a laughingstock. This shows that the author is not only saying that Yaldabaoth, because the author goes on to mention how these have deceived people as well, but so the author goes on basically to say that not only has the Jewish prophets been deceptive and leading people astray and literally teaching false beliefs because they have themselves been deceived by Yaldabaoth, they are laughingstocks. You just look at them, you point and laugh, and you just move on with your life and look to the true teachings, the Gnostic teachings, right? So what this is saying is that Jews have been deceived, but Christians, have also been deceived. Why? Because they follow John the Baptist as well. They see John the Baptist as a forerunner to Jesus. But what this text is trying to show is that John the Baptist, he's just one of these prophets. He's just like the rest. He's totally deceived. He didn't prophesize anything. Only Jesus has. Jesus is unprecedented, is basically the point then. There is no prophecy power in John the Baptist, no prophecy power in Moses and Abraham and blah, blah, blah. Only Jesus is unprecedented, and therefore the Christians who valorize John the Baptist, and the Jews who valorize the rest of the prophets, and the Christians who valorize the prophets, they are all deceived by Yahweh. And this is another instance of that cosmic deception working its way through all of creation. There's also a case to make that denigrating John the Baptist is also a denigration of another religion. But I'm going to leave that one for you guys, because that gives away too much. Anyway, what I will say is that these are two instances of deception, and we have seen how Yahweh is deceiving Jews and Christians, and therefore this constitutes another aspect of a definition of Gnosticism that I would say. It's a critical attitude towards traditional religious authorities. That being the Old Testament, the Jewish prophets, as well as the Christian New Testament, as well as those people that have at that time power in the Christian church. So by this time this text was written, almost certainly, I don't see a reason to deny this, the bishop episcopate had developed. There were bishops, and these bishops, there were competing bishops. Indeed, we know in Rome, in the year 200, there were two bishops, and there was not one bishop of Rome. There were two, and one of them was a Marcionite. And the first bishop of the first time that Rome had a single bishop seemed to be in about 205. But anyway, seemingly that was the case around other parts of the Christian world, multiple bishops per city, because different Christian groups are like, no, I'm the real bishop, and other Marcionite ones are like, I'm the real bishop, Valentinian ones are like, I'm the real bishop, and then you had quote-unquote Orthodox ones that would be like, I'm the real bishop. So what seems to be happening then is this is a clear denouncement of traditional religious institutions. So couple that with that belief in the deceptive demiurge, bring that together, one more point for to tie it all together, a belief in the self-divinization of creation. What this means, in basic terms, is that all people themselves are divine in themselves. Now, you're going to say, a smart commentator would go, hold on a second, this was believed by a lot of non-Gnostics. Origen believed this. Gregory of Nyssa believed this. Indeed. But did they believe, one, that the demiurge is deceptive? Neither believed in demiurge, but did they believe the demiurge was deceptive? Did they believe that a deep criticism towards traditional religious institutions? No. Therefore, they cannot fit Gnostic, and therefore, pointing out that other figures held this belief when taken as a vacuum is not an argument against putting this belief as a part of the definition of Gnosticism, because of how well it corresponds to Gnostic text. And on that point, I would recommend reading David Litwa's 2012 or 2014 book, Being Transformed, and then I would recommend Bermejo Rubio's 2023 journal article on self-divinization strategies in Gnostic text. There are things to critique, especially in Rubio's article, but you get a good feel for these instances of self-divinization, these moments where it's clearly like, hey, you as a human, you have the divine in you, and you realize that divine, and through realizing that divine, that is your soteriological process. That is the process by which you are saved. And again, this can be a very Orthodox belief. In fact, it is an Eastern Orthodox belief, I would say. It is a very cogent understanding of theosis, framing it in this fashion. And seemingly a lot of great Orthodox fathers through the years have framed it in this fashion. Theosis is the realization of your own divinity that is in potentia. You have that image of God. You have that divine seed in you, to use the Gospel of Thomas's language. You have that divine seed in you, but to realize that you have to undergo theoses, and you realize that you have to begin your worship of God, and you have to begin your spiritual life, and that then is the undergoing of theoses, the realization of that divine seed. So it is a very orthodox belief in a vacuum, but it is a very Gnostic belief when put in the context of those other 2 points of a definition of Gnosticism. There are other additional things about Gnosticism that are very good for an ideal definition, but I'm leaving you with those 3. And I gave you 2 episodes to demonstrate the main core tenets of the definition. And then the 3rd one, I pointed to other resources. So with that said, I'm going to conclude here. I really hope this was helpful. I've been studying this stuff now for about, a serious study began about 5 months. No, serious study began about 9 months ago. Serious study began about 9 months ago. Concentrated study on Gnosticism. And so I feel like I have some things to say and offer about this, and offer my voice and scholarship. And so, we'll see if I can get these 2 papers published. And the book has already been accepted. I'll be keeping that under wraps, where it will likely be published for right now, as we're still working out the legal details and all of that. But I look forward to hearing what you guys will respond with and have to say. I also look forward to checking out my Substack. Very interesting articles I've published on there. If you would like to purchase a paid subscription, it's like $6 a month. You're going to get access to a lot more stuff. The long articles I do will likely be paid because, you put in the labor, you want the resort, right? You want the value of you want the, I'm trying to think of the Marxian terms. It's, whatever. We should get the value of our labor. And if I put in long hours and create a good product, I would like some sort of response monetarily. Right, so with that said, that's going to be the end of this video. Subscribe down below, like the video, give it a share, and I hope to be more active on this channel. Thank you, and have a nice day.